Chapter 26 of Miss Pym's Camouflage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Miss Pym's Camouflage by Lady Dorothy Stanley. Chapter 26. Miss Pym's journey to Flanders was so trying that she could never think of it without a shudder. From Berlin to Cologne it took over 20 hours. She dared not get a ticket and go as an ordinary passenger. She stood for many hours in a corridor. But at Stendal she crawled into a luggage van, where she lay on a crate in darkness and stifling heat, afraid to sleep, had sleep been possible. Indeed, she became afraid of unconsciousness descending on her, and her fear was mainly on account of her precious rucksack, for if visibility returned to her unawares, all her belongings might be torn from her before she could disappear. At Cologne she went straight to a hotel near the station, and found an unoccupied room, where she was fortunate enough to sleep undisturbed. The next day she travelled more easily to Aachen, but suffered great discomfort on her journey to Brussels. She was too bruised and exhausted to take the interest she otherwise would have in this greatly tried capital of unhappy Belgium. She rested there quietly till she felt sufficient energy to get to Courtrai, where she was told the headquarters of the German army of the Northwest was established under General Sixt von Arnim. At Brussels she heard of a Prince Chemnitz belonging to the staff. He occupied the fine house of a Belgian banker near Courtrai, and was married to a very beautiful American, Miss Sadie Bung, who had an immense fortune. Perdita Pym was so tired of hotels, where she heard nothing of any value, that she determined to stay uninvited at the house of Princess Chemnitz. Arrived at Courtrai, she went first to a hotel, where, according to her custom, she commandeered the best room, and locking herself in, she carefully looked round, pulled down the blinds, and dragged a table to the wardrobe. Cautiously mounting the table, holding her canvas bundle, she tumbled it onto the top of the wardrobe, where it lay in a hollow, quite out of sight. In the town of Courtrai, Miss Pym, after making a few needful purchases, asked the address of Prince and Princess Chemnitz. Half an hour's walk beyond the tramway, in a pretty park, with a much neglected flower garden, stood a so-called chateau, rather in the style of a showy villa. Miss Pym, now invisible of course, searched high and low for a room, and decided to wait till night, when she could alight on any unoccupied room. The princess was out, but a beautiful little boy of 2½ the only child of the prince and princess, gave her a great fright. She was standing in the room where he was playing with his German nurse. Miss Pym was admiring his golden curls and exquisite colouring, when the child looked up at her, smiled, and held out his arms. As Miss Pym drew back, much alarmed, the little fellow toddled across the room to her. She knelt down and kissed him gently, but she was very careful to keep away from him, lest by touching her he too should disappear. Miss Pym realized that, though invisible to herself and others, she was visible to the little child. This might prove very awkward, since the child wanted to come to her. Might he not, by his insistence, somehow betray her presence? She managed to make her escape, and wandered down to the rather gaudy salon, opening on to a large conservatory. Miss Pym sat in a corner of the room, and, as she put it to herself, awaited developments. These quickly came in the persons of the prince and his American wife, the most lovely creature Miss Pym had ever set eyes on, tall, fair, faultless in feature and figure, but restless in thought and movement. She threw herself on a sofa, then jumped up and sat on the arm of the couch, swinging her feet. Then she walked up and down the room, her husband, a tall, handsome young German in uniform, watching her with adoring eyes. "You say I should invite von Hindenburg to stay here," she said, pouting, "and his shadow, his spokesman, Ludendorff, that it is a great honor for us. Well, Otto, I don't count it an honour at all. Oh, I know Krieg is Krieg, and I must meet and entertain horrid officers and their still horrider wives. But I think, when my own countrymen are out to kill Germans, I ought to be spared meeting Germans, and I ought not to be asked to receive them under my own roof. But Sadie, my angel, you are a German now, said Prince Chemnitz plaintively. I a German? No, siree. I'm no German, and I guess Otto Bung Chemnitz, Jr. is no German either. I want to get back with him to Montana, where you can join us after the war, and raise sheep or cattle. You said yourself that after this war Germany would be an impossible country to live in. You may bet your bottom dollar that after this war I get. Otto, my dear boy, don't ask me to invite von Hindenburg here. You say he is coming this afternoon to talk over plans with you. Why should I see him at all? He despises women. On the contrary, he is a good husband and father. His daughters are charming. What a pity you did not marry one of them, Otto. And the pretty creature came behind her husband's chair and put her arms round his neck. Let us escape to Holland, and then you could join our boys at the front and fight on the other side. Oh, it has turned out so dreadful being a German, if I really am a German. I don't believe a real downright American could ever feel German, not since the Americans came into the war. Why, every bit of Germanness fell from me the day the Lusitania was sunk. Sadie, your talk is terrible. I tremble lest anyone hear you and report you to headquarters. My mother wants me to shut you up in the Schwarzgreizschloss. She says you will bring disgrace and ruin on the family, and she wishes to educate Ottolin herself. She shall never, never have my boy. My boy is myself, and I guess no living being, no Hun hag, no Boche witch is going to take him from me. Are you speaking of my honoured mother? Said Prince Chemnitz, rising and turning pale. No words are too strong for anyone who would dare to attempt, I say attempt, to separate an American woman from her child. The princess stood up facing him, her eyes blazing, her cheeks aflame, and her golden hair, loosened by her passionate movements, hanging low on her white neck. Fortunately the scene was cut short by the arrival of Master Otto. His mother snatched him from his nurse and kissed him so violently that he set up a howl. Then catching sight of Miss Pym, he put out his arms to her, crying, "Schöne Dame, schöne Dame." "What does he mean?" said his mother, putting him down. He straightway crawled to Miss Pym, who edged away. Round the room he followed her, crying, "Pretty lady," at intervals. His father picked him up and, pointing to the princess, said in German, "There is the pretty lady." But Master Otto was as determined as his mother. He took his finger out of his mouth and pointed to Miss Pym by the door. As she slipped out, she heard him say with assurance, "Pretty lady gone." Von Hindenburg was to be there that very afternoon. Miss Pym's heart beat quite jumpily at the prospect of the meeting. She would be present at that important council. What might she not learn there? Unseen, she joined the family at lunch, taking what she required, and sitting in a corner of the dining room, her plate on her lap. At first it was very disconcerting, when the princeling kept on nodding at her, and pointing with his spoon in her direction. But after staring round, no one took any notice of the child's vagaries. Lunch was rather gloomy, but conversation was kept up for appearance's sake. When the servants had left, and Master Otto had been carried off, the prince and his wife sat together over coffee and cigarettes. "I suppose you will be hours and hours at this old powwow," said Sadie Chemnitz, blowing up little curls of smoke. "It is awfully important," said the prince gravely. "Von Hindenburg is to settle the line of retreat." "According to plan?" said his wife, looking quite innocent. "Yes," said the prince. I needn't tell you that the outlook is really hopeless. So von Hindenburg has come just to try his hand at prolonging the agony, said his wife, trying to blow smoke rings. There is no way of shortening it, said the prince simply. Excepting by surrender, she retorted. Do you see Germans surrendering? He replied angrily. Oh, I guess Germans will have to do exactly the same as any other conquered people. When they are beaten, they will give in. You are always saying, war is war. I now say, defeat is defeat. The prince looked sulky. Then rising, he said, Ah, well, since this is the biggest room in this beastly little hole, we shall have the conference here, so we had better give instructions accordingly. I must see to the wine and cigars. The princess then moved into the salon adjacent. Miss Pym followed, and enjoyed listening to her hostess singing coon songs in a low voice. This sweet, undisciplined American attracted her. It was a delight to look on such loveliness, such freshness. In her company the cruelty and horror of this German-made war could be forgotten for a little space. Suddenly the princess ran to the door and peeped out. Harsh gutturals and clinking of spurs could be heard. Miss Pym, in a fever to get out, had to wait whilst the princess watched, holding the door. But prolonged patience becomes wild impatience. Miss Pym wrenched the door open and rushed out, entering the council room as the officers were settling themselves round the table. Miss Pym stared. Was it possible? Could that man be von Hindenburg, the commander-in-chief, the man who held in his hands the destinies of Germany? Miss Pym looked, and a gasp of relief, with something like a sob of grief and fear, almost choked her. He looked so horrible and deadly, and yet at the same time so inadequate. She compared Sir Hugh Douglas, Sir Hector Russell, Sir Robert Williamson, Petain, Cadorna, Pershing, with this big German brute. His face had such an awful fascination for her that she could not move her eyes away. Miss Pym felt that he was brutal, forceful, contemptuous, and vain. His eyes, small and observant, had puffed underlids. His square face was fleshy and warty, but his mouth, his small mouth, gave him away. It was like the mouth of some dreadful flatfish of the depths, utterly cruel. Hindenburg repelled because he looked inhuman. He seemed to Miss Pym the very spirit of evil, made man. His uniform was much creased by his stout body, folds being ruckled up from under the arms round to the front. He sat absent-minded, staring about, whilst Ludendorff talked, a typical German officer, well set up, and having the military style of good looks common to many. Ludendorff constantly turned to von Hindenburg, as though he sought his agreement or his approval. But Hindenburg sat impassive, though occasionally he frowned. His nostrils distended, and he looked about suspiciously, like an animal nosing danger. Miss Pym began to have a very uneasy feeling. Now and then his small animal eyes seemed to rest on her, and she positively trembled. But this feeling passed when Ludendorff produced maps and began explaining Hindenburg's plan. The English here, at this point, are convinced that we shall hold this line, and that possibly we shall withdraw in this direction, said Ludendorff, running his finger along a line on the map, spread out on the table. The officers all came round and stared at the map, but Hindenburg took no notice whatever. Pardon me, said a grey-haired colonel in spectacles, but the enemy surely will be right. We must hold this line. Hindenburg beckoned to Prince Chemnitz and whispered something. The prince nodded and went out, and Hindenburg resumed his utter impassivity. If we abandon this position, continued the colonel, we give up a most important point. We lose the support of this line of railways. To me it looks like like running away. It would be too terrible. Surely, the commander-in-chief is not seriously contemplating such a course. And he looked at Hindenburg, who sat swinging his foot, and looking, as it seemed, straight at Miss Pym. There was a strained silence broken by the return of the prince, carrying bottles. He put a quart tumbler before Hindenburg, who laughed heartily, and made some joke to the prince. The glass was then half filled with beer, the general measuring off the amount with his finger. To this was added champagne till the foam ran over the side, and then Hindenburg drank without breathing. Everyone waited. When he had replaced the empty tumbler, with a wicked half-veiled smile he resumed his attitude of an indifferent spectator. "If we fall back," cried an eager young officer, "what becomes of these divisions?" And he pointed to another portion of the map. Miss Pym longed to come round and look at the map they were all so eagerly examining. Then she saw Hindenburg draw up to the table, take a sheet of paper, and commence drawing lines with a remarkably steady hand. Miss Pym cautiously moved round the table, and coming behind Hindenburg attentively watched him. When she moved, Hindenburg again threw back his head like a buffalo sensing danger. Hindenburg then drew the line of the Rhine, and writing the names of French and Belgian towns, he drew double lines of trenches and isolated forts marked by crosses, and wrote dates on them. He also indicated divisions by squares, with their numbers, then threw down the plan, saying with finality, "It is all there, just as Ludendorff tells you, just as you can see it on the map. Yes, we are to abandon those lines. I am glad Colonel Winkler thinks it impossible, because that is what I want the British to think. If we hold the line, we are finished. It is as clear as noonday. Oh, not at once. But Ludendorff will by and by explain why. We are crumbling, gentlemen. We must become mobile. We must facilitate the retreat of our guns and men in Belgium. I mark here where we shall echelon our forces. This plan is the only plan, and it is for the conservation of energy. Its value depends on secrecy and celerity." The sheet of paper passed from hand to hand. Hindenburg now pointed out his ideas on the map. Then, leaning back, he turned to Chemnitz and nodded at his glass, which was again filled. "Ludendorff will now develop the idea we have." The officers sat down again. Miss Pym was left standing, alone, at the table near Hindenburg. She saw the map and the plan there, almost under her hand, but a numbing fear held her back. Her heart beat like a winged thing caged behind her ribs. She could not follow what Ludendorff said. She could only struggle against a strange, inhibitory feeling, as though "you shall not" met "you must" in her brain. She turned her head away from the maps, and met Hindenburg's deadly eyes. Had those drinks made him a seer, by any chance? She could feel the heat radiating from his big body, and still she shivered. Suddenly he jumped up, shouting like a bull, like a minotaur. "There is someone here in the room. A spy. I feel it. Hold the door. Search!" Winkler walked to the door. The others gazed at Hindenburg, who turned about, putting out his arms, groping for someone, as in blind man's buff. Miss Pym made a tremendous effort at self-control. Moving out of reach of Hindenburg, she took up the map, folded it roughly, and stuck it in her belt. The small plan she rolled up into a ball in her nervousness, and ran it into her bodice with trembling fingers. Hindenburg kept on bellowing, "There is someone here. Feel round for him. You'll get him. Do as I do. Feel round." The officers, shocked at what they considered Hindenburg's drunken fit, drew together at the window. Even Colonel Winkler left the door. Ludendorff went up soothingly to Hindenburg, whose face and throat positively swelled and pulsated with excitement. Miss Pym tried to dart past him to the door, but he shot out his hand and caught her by the throat. She gave the agonized squeal of a hare caught by dogs, and to the horror of herself and everyone present, she reappeared. Even her captor relaxed his hold from amazement, and Miss Pym darted to the door and shot down the corridor into the drawing-room. "Save me! Hide me!" she cried to Princess Chemnitz, who, with extraordinary presence of mind, pushed her behind the sofa where she was sitting, and going to the piano, she began singing softly, "Oh, dem golden slippers." The officers, in full cry after Miss Pym, had been diverted for a few seconds by an open door leading into the princess' boudoir. Satisfied that she was not there, they now came full tilt into the salon. The princess looked round archly and said, "Is the meeting over, gentlemen?" "Have you seen a woman, a spy, rush in here?" cried her husband. "A spy? How exciting!" cried Princess Sadie, clasping her hands. "She would not come here, surely?" The prince looked at her suspiciously, noting her pallor. "Yes, here she is, right enough," cried Ludendorff, dragging Miss Pym up by the arm. The Germans crowded round her. Hindenburg, now quite calm, his evil little eyes exultant, stood looking at her. "The Englishwoman is caught, and if I mistake not, she has our map in her belt." Ludendorff snatched it with an exclamation of horror. Hindenburg, with an affectation of indifference, said, "I felt someone was there, in that room, all the time. However, no harm is done. We have the map, and the woman. Winkler, go outside and bring in my 4 men, also the sentinel, and your orderly, Chemnitz. Then take her out and shoot her." "And now, princess," said Hindenburg truculently, "how comes it you are concealing an English, or maybe an American, spy in the house of a German staff officer?" Prince Chemnitz walked up and stood beside his wife. "General, I will undertake to swear that my wife knows no more about this woman than you do yourself." "Sadie, speak! Tell General Hindenburg that you know nothing about her." "I never saw the woman before, and she is very likely a German," said the young princess, looking defiantly at Hindenburg. But Hindenburg was not susceptible to female charm, and he had taken enough champagne to excite him. He looked at her with intense hatred. "You belong to a nation at war with us, a nation of hypocrites and liars. I do not take the word of an American." Prince Chemnitz, as pale as his beautiful wife, advanced one step nearer to Hindenburg. "Do you dare, General, to insult my wife? To insult me? Here, in my own home?" "It will not be your home any longer, Prince. You will leave tomorrow for Riga. As for your American wife, she will go, by my orders, to your rocky Schloss, and consider herself under arrest there, where she will remain till this war ends. You have children?" The prince and princess were silent. General Ludendorff answered for them. "A son, General, a child. He will be entrusted to the care of his grandmother, Princess Elizabeth Chemnitz, who will bring him up to be a good German. I know the old lady. She will do her duty." "You would take my baby from me?" cried the young princess. "My own little baby? You shall not. Oh, you butcher! Oh, you vile—" Before she could finish the sentence, the lovely free-born American woman suddenly felt the room spin round. Darkness seemed to envelop her, and she collapsed where she stood into complete unconsciousness. The tramp of feet made Miss Pym look round. 7 German soldiers stood in the doorway. "Take that woman to the parade plots. Put her against the drill hall, and shoot her dead, at once. And stay, have all the new recruits present. It's good to blood their young snouts." Colonel Winkler interposed. "Would it not be as well to get some confession? Some signed deposition from the prisoner? Is it not desirable to go through some formality, however rapid, some formality of a trial? All that can be done after the execution, said Hindenburg savagely. What a mockery to talk of a trial or a confession. As for the woman's name, Spy is enough. Take her away, and report her death at headquarters. Now, order my car. You, Chemnitz, had better come round this evening. Colonel Boyce will give you your orders and some dispatches. Miss Pym was dragged out and marched along the dusty road to Courtrai. In vain she strove to disappear. Once she stopped, in her agony of mind, thinking that the motion of walking impeded the process of disappearing, but the sharp agony of a bayonet thrust in her left arm obliged her to go on, the warm blood trickling down and dropping through her fingers. Chapter 26